Today is Wednesday, 7th April, and we still await the response from Iran to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the Iranian capital, on the day when the new president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, was inaugurated. The Iranians have promised a response, and everybody is waiting anxiously to see what that response is going to be. Now, today is also the day when there is a meeting of the Organization of Islamic States. This was called by Iran and Pakistan directly after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, and I've always myself believed that Iran would hold back from launching any kind of attack on Israel, at least until after this meeting of the Organization of Islamic States took place. In the West, there's been little interest or attention given to this meeting, but in Iran, I think the mood there is very different. Certainly the Iranian authorities will be anxious to ensure that they get strong words of condemnation of the action that Israel has taken before they press forward and take any action of their own against Israel. And I think once that strong statement of support from the Islamic States, that united statement of support from the Islamic States has been provided, then that will provide the Iranians with a stronger position politically from which they can then take whatever action they consider is appropriate to respond to the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. In the meantime, we have received news about who is Ismail Haniyeh's successor is going to be, and it turns out, and perhaps unsurprisingly, that it's the most hardline, or perhaps the most hardline Hamas official of all, the very man who the Israeli government alleges is the mastermind of the attack on Israel on the 7th of October. It is none other than Yahya Sinwar, who the Israelis have been trying to find and kill in Gaza over the course of this military operation, the military operation that Israel has launched against Hamas in Gaza. Now, perhaps one day, perhaps soon, the Israelis will track down and will eliminate Yahya Sinwar. But as of this moment, it seems to me that what the Israelis have done is that they've eliminated a more, I won't say moderate voice within Hamas, but perhaps a more diplomatic one, and replaced it with a tougher, more hardline one. Anyway, that might have been the objective. Of course, if Israel does not want a ceasefire, or if the Netanyahu government does not want a ceasefire in Gaza, as I think is now blindingly obvious, then, of course, replacing Haniyeh with Sinwar actually makes a kind of sense. It will be more difficult, I would have thought, for the Israelis and the Americans and other Western officials, and even perhaps some of the BRICS and Arab states, to deal with Hamas once if Hamas is indeed led by someone like Sinwar, with Sinwar's reputation. Perhaps but not definitely. Sometimes, and I must also say this, when dealing with an organization like Hamas, third parties actually prefer to deal with the individual that they think is the one who is most hardline and who has the most authority, and on the basis that any deal cut with a person like that is more likely to stick. I've experienced this myself in various negotiations that I myself have been involved in. So, well, anyway, we'll have to wait and see. But anyway, having eliminated Haniyeh, who they had been pretending to negotiate with, the Israelis now find themselves dealing with a much more intractable, implacable figure in the form of Yahya Sinwar. Now, what will come over the next couple of days, I'm not in any way able to predict or foresee, but the Iranian reaction will come. Of that, I am sure. I think anyone who imagines that President Pezeshkian, the new Iranian leader, will want to moderate his stance on this because he's in the past spoken about the need for better relations with the West, I think is deluding themselves. I think President Pezeshkian himself will feel deeply humiliated by the fact that Haniyeh was assassinated by the Israelis on the day of his inauguration. And the other party, in my opinion, which has been humiliated by this affair is the United States, which is putting out the story that it was seeking in good faith to negotiate a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, and that the assassination by Israel of Hamas's chief negotiator was not only unknown to them, but undesired by them. And there is yet another article today in the Washington Post saying that the United States, the White House, is absolutely furious with Israel over what it has done. And there are also various reports appearing in the US media this morning about how the United States has been engaging Iran in diplomacy, trying to dissuade Iran from precipitate or decisive action, and that the fact that so far there hasn't been any action by Iran is being chalked up to the success, supposedly, of this American diplomacy. My own view is that the Iranians are long since past the point of paying any attention at all to what the Americans tell them. The Iranians, in my opinion, were never going to attack. To repeat again, they were never going to attack before the meeting today of the Organization of Islamic States. And yes, they might heed some calls of restraint, but they will only do so if they come from people that they see as reliable friends and from people who they believe actually have resources that they can provide to Iran to assist Iran in this crisis. The BRICS states, some of the Arab states, organizations like Hezbollah and the other Shia militias across the Middle East, it's the advice and urging of these people, of these countries, the Russians and the Chinese most importantly, but others too. It is those that the Iranians will be heeding. If they're listening to anyone at all, certainly not to what is coming to them from the United States, which by now they surely have lost all faith and confidence in. Anyway, that's the situation as of today. As I said, we've had fewer new developments over the course of the last 24 hours. The meeting of the Organization of Islamic State is the big event we're expecting today. I will return to this topic tomorrow, when we will have perhaps a slightly clearer view of where this particular crisis is going. In the meantime, there have been important developments in the conflict in Ukraine, and it is to those that I will now turn. The first thing to say is that, as many people who are watching these programs, of course, know, though I noticed that the British media is barely covering this story. As of this morning, Ukraine has launched another incursion onto Russian territory, specifically in the Kursk region. And we've had a succession of reports about this incursion from the Russian Defense Ministry, and it is to those reports from the Russian Defense Ministry that I will turn. So the first was published by the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday, and it says this: today from 8 a.m. Moscow time, up to 300 Ukrainian soldiers of the Ukrainian 22nd Mechanized Brigade, supported by 11 tanks and more than 20 armored fighting vehicles, launched an attack following preparatory fire at the positions of the Russian state border, covering force near Nikolaevo, Darino and Olyeshina in Kursk region, immediately adjacent to the border between Russia and Ukraine. The state border covering force repelled attacks and inflicted fire damage at the enemy and reserves along the border service of the Federal Security Service near the state border and on the territory of Sumy region. Operational, tactical and ground attack aircraft delivered strikes at the concentration areas of Ukrainian manpower and military hardware near Basovka, Zhuravka, Khoten, Yunakovka, Belodovi, Khrapovshini, all in Sumy region. Russian Army aviation effectively engaged the enemy's armor. Reserves of the Russian group of forces in Kursk direction moved to the battle area. As a result, the Ukrainian losses amounted to 16 units of hardware, including 6 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 4 armored personnel carriers, 3 Cossack armored fighting vehicles, and 1 counter-obstacle vehicle. So that was from the Russian Defense Ministry. And then they provided film of what they said was an Iskander operational tactical missile system strike at Ukrainian air defense positions in Sumy region. As a result of a precise missile strike, 2 Ukrainian Buk M1 SAM launchers were destroyed, and it's largely acknowledged that this was an attack connected with this fighting on the border. Then the Russian Defense Ministry published yet another report showing another film showing the destruction of an armored column of Ukrainian vehicles. I understand that they're American Stryker vehicles on the border with Kursk region, and it went along with the report today. The enemy has made one more attempt to infiltrate the territory of Kursk region and attack artillery, army, aviation, and attack drones of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, inflicted fire damage on the enemy. And then there's been a further report and from the Russian Defense Ministry, and it came out early this morning at 10 a.m. Moscow time this morning, and it reads: the armed forces of the Russian Federation, jointly with border authorities of the Russian Federal Security Service, have been destroying armed formations of the Ukrainian armed forces during last night in Kursk region areas immediately adjacent to the Russian-Ukrainian border. Air and missile strikes, artillery fire, as well as units of the state border covering force, in other words, the border guards, prevented the enemy from advancing deep into the territory of the Russian Federation in Kursk direction. The enemy's reserves have been damaged close to Basovka, Zhuravka, Yunakovka, Belovody, Kiyanitsa, Korchakovka, Novaya Sech, Pavlovka, and Gorodische, all in Sumy region. Enemy losses during the past 24 hours have amounted to 260 troops, 50 armoured vehicles, including 7 tanks, 8 armoured personnel carriers, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, 31 armoured fighting vehicles with 12 Cossack vehicles, 2 striker vehicles, 1 counter-obstacle vehicle and 6 motor vehicles among them. Moreover, 2 Buk M1 SAM self-propelled launchers, 1 UR-77 mine-clearing vehicle and 1 electronic warfare station have been annihilated. The operation to neutralise the Ukrainian units is in progress. Well, all of this is absolutely standard. We've seen this all happen. We've seen this all play out before in previous Ukrainian cross-border raids into Russian territory. The Russian authorities have responded in the same way as they always do. President Putin has convened the Security Council in Russia, as he always does. He's had, whenever there's an incursion by the Ukrainians of this kind, there's been a meeting between Putin and officials of the government in order to provide civilian assistance to the people of the border areas. There's also apparently going to be, after the Security Council meeting itself, a meeting between Putin and the top security officials in charge for managing matters on the border. And of course, there's also been a huge amount of excited commentary, huge amount of speculation about what's happening, claims that various villages have been captured by the Ukrainians, claims that some Russian troops have been encircled by the Ukrainians. Undoubtedly true reports that some Russian soldiers have been captured by the Ukrainians, though I suspect that these are mostly, probably, from the border guard units. And anyway, lots of that sort of thing. And this is, as I said, absolutely standard whenever these border incursions take place. The one thing that makes this particular border incursion by the Ukrainians rather different from some of the others is that it does look as if an entire brigade of the Ukrainian army has been committed to this operation. So that's, well, perhaps 4,000 men, not significantly different from what we saw previously in Belgorod region, but anyway, an operation of that nature being carried out this time. But as I said, one specific brigade operating in this way, and well, this attack in that form is now underway. What exactly does this all mean? What exactly is this all going to achieve, and what is the effect of it going to be? Well, in terms of the overall direction of the war, the course of the war, it is going to achieve absolutely nothing. In fact, it is a diversion of valuable men and apparently one of Ukraine's best remaining military units to an operation on the Kursk border where it is certain to suffer significant losses. The Russians will eventually push the Ukrainians back from the border area into Sumy region, and the brigade itself will be defeated, the Ukrainian brigade will be defeated, and the Russians will reoccupy whatever territory the Ukrainians might temporarily be occupying. A force of 4,000 men is not going to be sufficient to control the situation in the border in any significant way. And over and above and beyond that, of course, we have lots of reports that there are in fact tens of thousands of Russian troops in the area of the border. A report I received some weeks back spoke about as many as 100,000 Russian troops being stationed in Kursk region, in this area, along the border, the border with Sumy region. And in fact, there's been lots of speculation that those Russian troops might at some point in fact engage in an offensive of their own into Sumy region, which, by the way, up to this time, they haven't done. Also, precisely in this same area, in Sumy region, there have been lots of reports that Russian incursions across the border into Sumy region, precisely here, have taken place. That Russian troops have, in fact, even occupied villages, Ukrainian villages, inside Sumy region for some periods of time. And Kirill Budanov, the Ukrainian military intelligence chief, the man who I suspect is again the prime organizer and orchestrator of this operation, this latest operation, he's actually said that the situation along a part of the border, Ukraine's border, is deteriorating, but he didn't want to discuss this in too much detail because he didn't want to create a sense of panic in Ukraine about how bad the situation on the border had become. And as I remember, he said this just about 2 weeks ago. So this is the area where all of this has happened. There's been, as I said, a large concentration of Russian troops in the area, according to various reports. There have been cross-border raids by the Russians into Sumy region, precisely this area. Before, the Russians are reported at various times to have briefly occupied various Ukrainian villages. The Russian artillery and air forces have been fairly active. There's been speculation about a Russian offensive in this area. And Budanov, who seems to be the person in overall charge of the area, has talked about a deteriorating situation. And I am going to suggest that this is the context in which this latest incursion has taken place. There's been a shadowy duel between the Russians and the Ukrainians along the border between Kursk in region in Russia and Sumy region in Ukraine for some time. And as is his way, Budanov, backed no doubt by Zelensky in Kiev, has decided that the time has come for him, therefore, to make a big splash. And he's sent a brigade, one of Ukraine's elite mechanized assault brigades. These are the best best brigades in the Ukrainian army across the border into Russia in order to, well, achieve what exactly? Nobody seems to know precisely because, of course, military objectives don't seem to be particularly the point of these operations anymore. It looks, on the contrary, as if the major purpose, as always, is to wrong foot the Russians, embarrass them, give the Ukrainian people a morale boost. Ukraine has been very active trying to boost morale recently. It's just received a number of F-16s and it's been flying them in the skies over places like Lvov and Odessa. And Zelensky himself has had himself photographed with them next to them. And there was an attack, as I said, on a building on a promontory in Kherson region, Russian-controlled Kherson region, where a lighthouse is located. So another attempt to boost morale and to wrong-foot the Russians in an area of the border, dangerously close, as the Ukrainians probably feel, to Kiev itself, by launching a cross-border raid. Now, as to the exact events, what's exactly happening on the border, it's important to stress that we have no real confirmation of many of the claims that people are making. I take the reports that the Russian Defense Ministry is giving as reliable. For example, the pictures and the claims by the Russian Defense Ministry that they've destroyed 2 Buk missile launchers. I think there's no doubt at all that those reports are true. As to the capture by the Ukrainians of 2 or 3 villages, that might have happened, but so far I have seen no visual evidence that this is the case, and I would have thought that if the Ukrainians had indeed captured villages by now, they would be eager to make the fact known by publishing film and photographs of their troops in those villages. The most level-headed account of the fighting and of what's happened has been provided, in my opinion, by Intel Slava, a Telegram channel publishing in English, but as its name implies, one that has a very strong pro-Russian orientation. Anyway, this is what they say. And I think, as I said, that this is as good an analysis of the situation as any that you will find speaking today, Wednesday, 7th August. Maybe by the time you watch this program, we will have more detailed developments and a more clearer idea of what is going on. But anyway, this is what Intel Slava says. It seems that the main objective of the first phase of Ukraine's operation in Kursk region would have been to capture the small town of Sudzha, 6,500 inhabitants, but they failed. Russian troops present managed to hold out long enough until the arrival of more serious reinforcements to withstand the initial onslaught. Despite heavy losses which the Ukrainians suffered, further north, they were more successful there, flanked by a body of water. The 22nd Mechanized Brigade seems to be fully engaged in this task and is attempting to take advance in the direction of Lebedyevka. Now, it seems to me that the Russians have been tracking Ukrainian movements very precisely. I've seen some of the drone footage, which shows Russian drones hovering over these Ukrainian armored columns. There's some pictures which show in extremely sharp definition, which the Russians have published, Ukrainian soldiers on foot moving and taking up positions. So it seems to me that the Russians have a very, very close understanding of what is going on. There's also pictures that have appeared of the Russian Air Force being active in this area. At least 2 Sukhoi 25 fighter bombers operating actively in the area. And, anyway, the Russian military has been in action, and probably over the next couple of days, we're going to see more and more of it being brought to bear. Probably as a result of the meetings that are taking place in Moscow today, the Russians will deploy more troops from deep inside Russia. Anybody who thinks that they're going to redeploy forces to any significant extent from the existing front lines, I am sure is wrong. Anyway, and as I said, at some point, a couple of days, in a week, perhaps longer, the Russians will bring the situation under control. It doesn't mean that until then, the Ukrainians won't be able to make hay to some extent. Perhaps they've captured, as I said, a number of villages. I've seen no confirmation of that. Maybe eventually they will manage to capture this small place, Suja, or at least enter it, as they've done with other small towns in Belgorod region. But eventually the Russians will push them out. And then probably the sequel is going to follow the same pattern as what we saw happen with Belgorod region, which is that Putin will give instructions that a buffer zone be established along the border in Kursk region. So we see a Russian offensive carried out by the regular forces of the Russian army across the border in Kursk region, entering Sumy region, and ultimately the very thing that the Ukrainians have been striving to avoid, or so one might suppose, which is a Russian offensive in Sumy region, a serious Russian offensive in Sumy region, like the one we're now seeing play out in Kharkiv region, is likely to happen. And I'm fairly confident that decisions to that effect are being made at this precise time in Moscow now. That will be the outcome of all of these various meetings. How does this assist the Ukrainians? Well, ultimately, I don't see that it does. It creates another front for the Ukrainians fighting in other places, another front line, even as their forces are becoming dangerously overextended. Their major units, their main units, are losing men and material. And one would have thought that the very last thing they would want to do is to open up a new front lines. And if you follow commentaries by Ukrainian commentators, they are very angry about this latest attack. There was a commentary, I think it was on Resident yesterday, about Ukrainian troops being sent on another suicide mission into Kursk region. There's been reports in other places. I think Yuri Butusev, the well-known Ukrainian military commentator, has written a fairly careful comment about this affair, but implicit in it is the question, why are some of Ukraine's best men being sent to fight and die in Kursk region in Russia, where they're not going to be able to achieve anything of military significance, even as the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass collapse? And we're going to see more reports like this appear in all sorts of other places. In fact, there have already been more reports appear in all sorts of other places across the Ukrainian reporting and blog sphere. And even someone like David Axe at Forbes, who's an enthusiastic supporter of Ukraine, somebody who looks all the time for reasons to trash whatever it is that the Russians are doing, even he appears to be skeptical about the logic of this operation. He also senses that it is a further mistake. And, well, I am sure that's right. As I said, it's not impossible that the Russians will be embarrassed in some way over the next couple of days. We'll see. But as I said, for the moment, the general consensus is that this is a mistake, and I've no doubt at all that over time, as happened in Belgorod region and elsewhere, the Russians will bring this whole situation under control. Their forces in this area are too strong, and the Ukrainians by now ought to know the fact. So, what is again the point of all of this? Why are Budanov and Zelensky doing this? Why is General Sirski going along with what Budanov and Zelensky are saying? Well, there's been lots of talk about Ukrainian offensives recently. There was talk about a Ukrainian offensive in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region, which never materialized. There are constant drumbeat of reports that the Ukrainians might be planning some further operation to try to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. There's been a report about this today in the Russian news agency TASS, and it reads as follows. After attacking Russia's Kursk region, Ukrainian troops may intensify combat activity near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to gain leverage ahead of potential talks with Russia, a member of Russia's public chamber told TASS. The member of Russia's public chamber turns out to be our old friend Vladimir Rogov, who is now chairman of the Chamber's Commission for Issues of Sovereignty, Patriotic Projects and Support for Veterans. And he says this: the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is on Kiev's agenda, with Zelensky returning to this topic over and over again. I think that after the Kursk region, they will attempt attacks on Belgorod region and then near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Prior to that, Ukraine's army will try to thin out our troops to delay our advance in all key areas and conceal the strengthening of the Zaporozhye front line. The Ukrainian army's posturing is geared towards gaining more leverage ahead of potential talks with Russia. They're seeking to do something to divert attention from the fact that they are losing a settlement nearly every day. And the Zelensky regime understands that things are getting hairy. So on the one hand, we see statements about talks, and on the other hand, attempts to strengthen their position ahead of them. Well, that's probably as good an explanation as you're going to get. It's important to say that when someone feels that they're going down, they do have there is a tendency, and it's not just a tendency in war, it is a tendency in many things. I've seen it play out many times. There is a tendency to lash out, to do something dramatic, to show to the other side we're still strong. We may appear to be losing, but we're still strong. We can still hurt you in some way. And of course, to reassure themselves, to reassure the Ukrainians reassuring themselves that they're still strong, that they're still able to take the fight into Russia, to cause Putin upset and embarrassment. But I'm sure that, well, I'm not sure, but I think it is likely that Rogov is up to something when he says that what the Ukrainians are trying to do, as they realize that they're losing the war, is take some steps that will somehow strengthen their position in negotiations, launch an advance into Kursk, launch some more attacks on Belgorod region, perhaps try again to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, incredibly dangerous though that is. Do something like that in the belief that this will mean that Ukraine in the autumn is going to be able to go into talks from a stronger position than the one it would otherwise be in. If that is the thinking, then it reflects desperation, the recklessness and the feverish type of thinking that comes from desperation. Because, of course, the reality is that it's going to do the exact opposite. Firstly, with the Ukrainians launching more attacks into Russian territory like this, not only is it going to encourage the Russians to open another front line in Sumy region, something which the Ukrainians should have sought to avoid, but far from persuading the Russians that negotiations are a good idea, it's going to make the Russians even more convinced that the Ukrainians are an impossible and unacceptable negotiating partner. And in fact, there's been an article about this in Izvestia, important Russian newspaper. And this was, by the way, published before the Kursk operation got underway. And this article makes, again, extremely clear the deep skepticism the Russians have about negotiations with Ukraine and their deep doubts that Ukraine is remotely a party that they can afford to negotiate with. And the article, the summary that TASS provides of this article reads as follows. Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that he intends to prepare a real base for the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict by the end of the year, whilst the politician is outwardly trying to show the world how ready he is for dialogue. His true intentions are much different, as in reality, saving his own skin is his one and only goal, former Ukrainian Parliament Deputy Vladimir Olenik told Izvestia. In many ways, this diplomatic balancing act is related to the unpredictable course of the US election campaign. Zelensky's plans to invite Russia to a second peace summit support the narrative that Ukraine is seeking a settlement. However, the actions of the Ukrainian military are a much clearer indication of official Kiev's real desire for peace. On August 6th, they attempted to break through to the territory of Russia's Kursk region. Zelensky's goal is not saving Ukraine and Ukrainians. The goal is saving his own skin. He's only concerned about his future and the future of his family. He doesn't care about what happens to Ukraine, Olenik told Izvestia. Political scientist and member of the Other Ukraine movement, Alexander Dudchak, also questions the sincerity of this peace rhetoric. He told Izvestia Ukraine's position is no different than it has been for the past 2 years. Despite all the peace initiatives from Kiev and the West, peace talks remain out of the question as long as Ukraine has a decree in place prohibiting negotiations with Russia. Olenik noted that since Russia considers Zelensky an illegitimate president, the possible lifting of the decree should be signed by the legitimate leadership. Dudchak generally agrees, but also believes that Zelensky could himself sign a document cancelling the decree, assuming Washington allows this. So, the Russians, deeply skeptical that the Ukrainians are interested in negotiations, and looking at these actions, the attack in Kursk, the possible attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and coming away convinced that peace with Ukraine is impossible, at least whilst it continues to be led by its current government. So, if the intention behind all of these moves is to strengthen Ukraine's position ahead of negotiations, what it is actually much more likely to achieve is extinguish the possibility of those negotiations taking place at all. And of course, and above and beyond that, is likely to cause more losses to the Ukrainian military, and it is also likely to lead to a further Russian operation in Sumy region as well. Lastly, what all of these actions do is that they thin out Ukraine's front lines. Vladimir Rogov spoke about all of these operations, the Ukrainians taking operations to try to get the Russians to thin out their lines. But then, as the Ukrainians themselves admit, the Russians at the moment have no shortage of manpower. In fact, their manpower is much greater than Ukraine's. So it is the Ukrainians who, once again, are diverting resources into adventures which, in the end, are not going to play out to their advantage. Anyway, that's all I can say at the moment about this Kursk operation. No doubt we'll be getting a lot more over the next couple of hours. I would suggest that everybody who follows this keeps a level head and remembers, as I said, that these events in Kursk region, whatever it is that we're seeing in Kursk region, is likely to be fairly ephemeral. That has been true of all other Ukrainian cross-border operations in the past. I see no reason to think that this one will be any different. There's been some very excited language about what the Ukrainians are doing, but one mustn't assume or suppose that it's going to translate into anything much in the end. In the end, ultimately, just as the Belgorod operations resulted in Russia opening a front or finding reason to open a front in Kharkiv region, which has deepened the crisis of the Ukrainian army in Donbass, this operation is going to provide Russia with another pretext to begin the long-feared offensive in Sumy region, which is going to further increase the crisis that Ukraine faces in Donbass region. And it is to that briefly now that I'm going to turn. Firstly, yesterday, a film appeared on the Russian internet showing Russian soldiers raising the Russian flag over a school building in the village of Niu-York, which apparently is about, it looks like it, we will soon be calling it Novgorodsky again. I ought to say, by the way, that this name New York is the name this village previously had under the Russian Empire. It was apparently being called that all the way back in the 1850s. So it's not such a new name. It doesn't reflect the recent alignment of Ukraine with the United States. As I said, it's the historic name of this village, if you like, but it is not the name that the Russians use. Anyway, the Russians have raised their flag over the school building. It looks as if the battle for New York is close to coming to an end. When the Russians start raising flags over villages, it's not a sign that they are in complete control of the village, but it is a sign that the battle for the village is gradually coming to an end. And in fact, there's been a report, again on TASS, about the state of the fighting in New York, and it comes from a source in the security forces, an anonymous source, and he says that New York is encircled. Ukrainian troops in the township are not in the best condition. The Ukrainian military are in a critical position on this section of the line of engagement. And it does indeed seem as if the Russians are making not just progress in New York, but progress right across the whole Toretsk area. I discussed yesterday how there's been an article in the New York Times which also speaks of a major of the battle for Toretsk taking a desperate turn. And this is true elsewhere on the front lines. Yesterday I mentioned that the village of Timofeevka in the Pokrovsk area has now been captured by the Russians. It looks as if there are lots of reports now that the battle for Zelanye is also coming to an end. Reports that the Russians now control a significant part of this village, that there are Ukrainian troops surrounded in this village as well, and it's likely that this village will also soon fall under Russian control, bringing the Russians closer to Selidovo, the important towns of Selidovo and Pokrovsk itself, and making Russian positions there look even stronger than they are, preparing the positions for the Russians to make further advances westwards towards Pokrovsk. And we've had more reports that the Russians have made further progress inside the village of Konstantinovka, south of Marinka, near to Vuhledar. More pictures have appeared of Russian tanks operating inside Konstantinovka, and this time we are talking about tanks rather than just armoured vehicles. So the fighting for Konstantinovka also seems to be extremely intense, and it's likely that at some point over the next few days we will be getting news that Konstantinovka has either fallen or is close to doing so. And, well, we've had less news from Chasiv Yar, from Kupiansk, from Volchansk, from all of these other places. But all of the reports cumulatively continue to speak of Russian advances. And there's been a long article now in the Financial Times which concedes as much and talks about a deteriorating situation across the front lines for Ukraine. I not propose to go over this article in the Financial Times in detail, but it is the first admission I've ever seen in the Financial Times or in any big mainstream British media outlet that the war is going badly for Ukraine, not just in one particular sector, not as was the case in Bakhmut or Avdiivka, but that the entire Ukrainian military strategy and the entire way in which the war is being conducted is going wrong, and that Ukraine, in effect, is losing. So let's pick on some of the points the article makes. It says things like this: Russian forces have made significant and swift territorial gains in Ukraine, taking advantage of Kiev's military shortages and blunders as support grows amongst the Ukrainian public for a negotiated end to the war. The eastern Donetsk region is the central focus of Moscow's renewed offensive, which began late last year but has significantly increased in recent weeks. And then they make a claim: President Putin's main battlefield goal this year is to grab as much land as possible, according to senior Ukrainian officials. Our defenses are showing cracks, said one senior Ukrainian official familiar with military operations. He warned that Russian forces had achieved tactical success in Donetsk and that more advances were likely unless the situation turns round. Taken together, Russia's advances have more than reversed the hard-fought gains made by Ukraine's army last year. According to research by Pasi Paroinen of the Blackbird Group, an open-source military research group based in Finland, the amount of territory captured by Russian troops since early May is nearly double that which Ukraine's military won back at heavy cost in terms of lives and material with its summer offensive a year ago. Some officials are optimistic that Russia's offensive will slow as its forces near larger cities where Ukrainian defences are more solid. Well, that is true. I mean, almost certainly true, unless the defences of the cities collapse. But of course, if the Russians reach the cities, that is already a critical situation for Ukraine. And then we have this interesting aside about the attack in Kursk. A surprise offensive on Tuesday by Ukraine's forces inside the Russian border region of Kursk seemed to indicate that Kiev is trying to turn the tables on Moscow. But the move, which has not been officially acknowledged by Ukrainian leaders, also prompted criticism from analysts who questioned the wisdom of deploying overstretched soldiers on Russian land. So there you are. Apparently there's also an article in the New York Times in which other military analysts make exactly the same point. So the media in the West is going, for the moment, with the same analysis that many Ukrainian commentators are going, that this advance into Kursk region is another irresponsible and reckless waste of resources. And then the article goes on to say, over the past week, the Russian army advanced within 15 kilometers of the garrison city of Pokrovsk and the outskirts of nearby Toretsk, according to military analysts. Reviews of combat footage and interviews with Ukrainian soldiers and senior officials. Well, there's no doubt about that. But anyway, it also captured part of the neighboring town of New York and is still pressing ahead. Pokrovsk is a major logistical hub for Ukraine's military that has become a linchpin for its defense of the Donetsk region, whilst Toretsk and New York have been bulwarks against Russian forces since 2014. The Russians are just 5 kilometers from the main TO 504 highway, that's the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar, bombarding it with artillery and drones and threatening to cut it off. Despite the intensity of the fighting around Pokrovsk, we have a Ukrainian soldier telling us that the Russians are running out of steam. I see no sign of that myself. And then we're also told that Russian troops over the weekend occupied parts of Chasiv Yar's eastern district. Now, what they're referring to here is that the Russians have established themselves not in eastern Chasiv Yar, but in central Chasiv Yar, west of the canal. The fact that they talk about the Russian troops having done this over the weekend confirms as much. And then we're told that the city is strategic in its geographical position on high ground and as a gateway to other important cities. The capture of any of these cities would hinder military logistics and threaten control over the rest of the region, Ukraine's control over the rest of the region, putting the remaining strongholds of Konstantinovka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk in Russia's crosshairs. The Russians have managed to capture several key positions and terrain features within the past month, with the situation steadily deteriorating for the Ukrainians in these directions. Kiev's forces liberated roughly 321 square kilometers between June 1st and September 1st, 2023, or an average of 24 square kilometers each week. But Russia's offensive this year has erased those gains. Between May 3rd and August 2nd this year, the Russians have seized about 592 square kilometers, or more than 45 square kilometers a week. Now, there is a fundamental fallacy in all of this. It is treating the Russian progress, again, as something that can be measured in terms of the area of territory gained. and as Brian Poletic, Alex Vashinin, Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, Daniel Davis, Alex Christoforou, and yours truly have been repeatedly pointed out. This is a fallacious reasoning. The Russians have been conducting a war of attrition. One should rather be looking at the scale of Ukrainian losses than the amount of territory in square kilometers gained. Also, the comparators used here are flawed. The analysis compares Ukrainian gains in territory made over the entire course of their summer offensive from 4th June 2023 until 1st September 2023 to Russian advances across a limited period from 3rd May 2024 to 2nd August 2024, whereas the ongoing Russian offensive that we are discussing actually began in October last year. And since October, the Russians have captured a great deal of territory. In fact, if you add on what they achieved in the first part of 2023 when they captured Bakhmut, and in the last weeks of 2023, the Russians, as is widely acknowledged, actually captured more square kilometers of territory in 2023 than Ukraine did, despite the fact that Ukraine attempted its summer offensive in 2023. And of course, over the course of 2024, Russia has captured Avdiivka. It's essentially captured Krasnogorovka. It is about to capture Chasiv Yar. It is likely before long to capture Toretsk and perhaps Volchansk, and it is at the gates of Pokrovsk. And of course, if all of these places fall over the next few months, then the situation for Ukraine will go from being critical to becoming existential. So, and of course, added to all of the other things, we've discussed the enormous losses that the Ukrainians have suffered. 115,000 men over the last of the previous 2 months, June and July, according to Shoigu. Vast numbers of material, all of those things. So actually, the situation of the Ukrainians is much worse than this article says, even though it is admitting the extent to which the Russians have made rapid advances over the last few months since the 2nd of May. And of course, the 2nd of May is an important date because it also happens to be the date when Russia began its Kharkiv offensive. And we've seen the crisis that caused, with the Ukrainians having to strip their front lines of troops in order to try to stabilize the situation in Kharkiv region. And we're then told about the fact that the Ukrainians are outmanned and outgunned, and that their forces are worryingly thin across the 1,000-kilometer long line. We've there's a report that analysts and soldiers say Russia has also taken advantage of Ukrainian miscommunication and bungled battlefield rotations, which have enabled rapid advances in several instances, particularly around Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Of course, bungled battlefield rotations are the product of battered units being redeployed. They're not simply, things that happen. It's because the Ukrainian army has suffered such severe losses that it's not able to rotate its forces properly. And we then go on to read that the recent Russian advances caught Ukrainian forces off guard after slower but still steady gains through spring. They come 2.5 years into Moscow's all-out invasion. In fact, the reason why the advances have accelerated, and I've been saying for weeks that the tempo of Russian advance has been accelerating, is because the effect of the over the long term effect of attrition upon the Ukrainian army. And then we read that manpower remains the most pressing issue for the Ukrainians. France Stefan Gady, an associate fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, said the most immediate cause of ongoing Russian progress was Ukraine's prevailing lack of manpower, primarily infantry. What we're seeing now is essentially the Russians trying to exploit this, and that Kiev has been too slow in mobilizing more troops. So again, Ukraine being told always to go on mobilizing, and then we're told that further on that the Kharkiv offensive has stretched Ukraine's forces even further and left them with fewer reserves to respond to Russian advances towards Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, and the Ukrainians are about to make that problem worse by their operations in Kursk region, which, as I said, are quite plausibly going to trigger an advance towards a Russian offensive in Sumy region. And then we have Rob Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program, said that he expects Russia's efforts in Donetsk to intensify this month. So far from running out of steam, the Russians, according to Gady, look likely they're going to intensify. He says it's clear that the Russians are trying to push on to Konstantinovka, that's the town of Konstantinovka, describing the city as a major objective once Chasiv Yar falls. He says Ukrainians may need to revisit the concept of active defense that was employed at the start of the year but has since broken down. I've never seen any sign of any active defense being conducted by the Ukrainians. Brian Beletic has done a good piece about this. And then Gady goes on to ask the question, is it really better to defend every inch of Ukrainian territory no matter what? Or would it not be better to pull back from certain more exposed positions? Even if it meant giving up territory, it could help to preserve limited manpower and might ultimately strengthen defences. The major question is, when will this front line really stabilise and where? Well, if you've been following these programmes, if you've been following us on the Duran, if you have been going and reading or listening the many analyses by all the people I previously mentioned, Brian Beletic, Alex Machinin, Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, Scott Ritter, all of those, if you've been following all of them, then none of this would be news to you. But I suspect that people reading the Financial Times will be very, very alarmed to be reading things like this, even if they are probably trying to gain comfort from the latest news from Kursk. Anyway, there we are. Notice never the word peace anywhere in this article. Talk about negotiations, but it's all still negotiations on Western terms. That's the implicit message behind the article. And still no ability to acknowledge that Russian advances that are taking place risk becoming existential for Ukraine. Until and unless this last point is understood and we get a serious move by the Western powers to begin negotiations, we're going to continue to see the situation for Ukraine go from bad to worse. As we have seen with this latest adventure in Kursk, the Ukrainians are incapable of conducting a serious approach to negotiations. Instead, what they try to do is to throw the Russians off balance in some way, despite the fact that by this point in the war, it should be obvious that even if from time to time you can take the Russians by surprise, you can never panic or disorganize them. Anyway, there we are. First admission that I have seen in the British media that the war in Ukraine is being lost. It doesn't exactly say this, but it appears to prepare the ground. Notice the rhetorical question at the end. The major question is, when will this front line really stabilize, and where? Perhaps never and nowhere. Just saying. On that thought, I'm going to end this program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget too that you can check out our shop, links under this video, where you can buy all sorts of amazing things, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.